No, you should have seen his face, man. Yeah, I told him the shipment was stuck in Fresno. He bought it. Yeah, I'll have the paperwork signed by Friday. Relax. Hey, trust me, I got this. We'll toast to it next week.
The voice on the recording was relaxed, almost cheerful, the way someone might sound while discussing weekend plans with an old friend. But the words being spoken would become the most devastating evidence ever presented against a business owner in Clearwater County. I'm telling you, I'm just going to keep trimming his paycheck until he finally breaks and walks out. Eventually, he'll give up, and I won't have to put up with people like him around here anymore. Bringing him on was the worst decision I ever made. Those words, captured through a cracked window on a muggy afternoon in late October, would set in motion a chain of events that would destroy a business empire, expose a carefully hidden pattern of racism, and prove that even the most confident perpetrators eventually reveal who they really are when they think nobody is listening. This is the story of how one man's refusal to accept injustice, combined with patience, documentation, and one critical moment of opportunity, brought down an employer who thought he was too smart to get caught. It is a story about what happens when hatred meets accountability, when years of discrimination are captured in a few minutes of unguarded conversation, and when a community finally learns the truth about someone they thought they knew. If stories about justice, workplace rights, and the moments when ordinary people stand up against those who abuse their power resonate with you, then you are going to want to stay until the very end. Consider subscribing now, because what unfolds over the next hour demonstrates exactly why knowing your rights and documenting everything can change the course of your life. This is not just one man's story. This is a blueprint for how the system can work when you have the evidence to make it work. The morning sun was just beginning to cut through the fog hanging over Millbrook, a working-class town about 40 miles outside the state capital, when Darnell Harris pulled his aging sedan into the parking lot of Grayson Materials and Supply. It was a Tuesday in March of 2020, and Darnell was arriving for what he hoped would be the beginning of a new chapter in his life. At 36 years old, with a wife named Keisha, who worked as a certified nursing assistant, and 2 children who seemed to need new shoes every other month, he needed this job more than he wanted to admit. His previous employer, a packaging facility on the other side of town, had closed its doors without warning 4 months earlier. One afternoon, the workers had been called into the break room and told that operations were ceasing immediately. There was no severance. No warning, just a final paycheck and a stack of unemployment forms. For 16 weeks, Darnell had searched for work, filling out applications, attending interviews, and watching his savings account shrink week by week. When Grayson Materials called him back for a second interview and then offered him a position, the relief he felt was almost physical. The company was housed in a large metal building on an industrial road at the edge of town. Inside, the warehouse stretched over 16,000 square feet, with towering shelves filled with the materials that contractors throughout the region depended on. Lumber, bags of cement mix, copper and PVC piping, power tools, hand tools, fasteners, safety equipment, and hundreds of other items that kept the construction industry moving. The operation was not huge, employing about 14 people total, but it served as a critical supplier for dozens of construction companies across 3 counties. Vernon Grayson, the owner, was a heavy-set man in his early 50s with graying hair and the confident demeanor of someone accustomed to being in charge. He had founded the company more than 2 decades earlier and had built it into a reliable, profitable operation through a combination of hard work, local connections, and an understanding of what contractors needed. When he shook Darnell's hand at the end of the second interview and offered him the warehouse associate position, his grip was firm and his smile seemed genuine. "We're a small operation, but we're tight-knit," Vernon said, leaning back in his leather office chair. "You show up, you work hard, and there's room to grow here. I've had guys start on the warehouse floor and work their way up to running entire departments. It all depends on what you bring to the table." The starting wage was $19 per hour, which was less than Darnell had been making at the packaging plant, but it was stable work with the promise of advancement. He accepted without hesitation what he did not know as he walked out of Vernon's office that morning and into the cavernous warehouse to begin his first shift was that every other warehouse worker at Grayson Materials had been started at $24 per hour. The delivery drivers made between 26 and 29. The office staff earned even more. Darnell had been offered the lowest starting wage of any employee Vernon Grayson had hired in over 5 years. There was one obvious difference between Darnell and every other person working in that building. He was the only black employee at Grayson Materials and Supply. The first few months passed in a blur of hard work and adaptation. Darnell threw himself into the job with the same intensity he had brought to every position he had ever held. He arrived at the warehouse 35 to 40 minutes before his shift began each day, using the quiet early morning hours to study the layout of the facility and memorize the location of every product category. The warehouse was organized in a system that made sense to the people who had worked there for years, but presented a steep learning curve for newcomers. Most new hires took 2 months or more to navigate the space efficiently. Darnell mastered it in less than 4 weeks. He had a gift for spatial reasoning, an ability to create mental maps that allowed him to navigate complex environments with unusual precision. Within his first month, he could locate any item in the warehouse without consulting the inventory system. By his second month, he was suggesting improvements to the organization scheme, recommending that high-turnover items be moved closer to the loading docks and that related products be grouped together to reduce fulfillment time. His suggestions were implemented, and the average time to complete an order dropped by nearly 40%. His coworkers noticed immediately. Kyle Dawson, the senior warehouse worker who had been with the company for nearly a decade, told Darnell one afternoon that he was the fastest learner they had ever seen. Marcus Webb, one of the delivery drivers, joked that Darnell was making the rest of them look bad by comparison. Even the office staff commented on how much smoother operations had become since his arrival. Vernon noticed too. In the monthly staff meetings, he would occasionally mention that the warehouse was running more efficiently than it had in years. He never specifically credited Darnell, but everyone understood who was responsible for the improvements. Contractors began requesting Darnell by name when they called in complicated orders, knowing that he would get every detail right the first time. His error rate was essentially zero. In his first 6 months, he personally fulfilled over 2,000 orders without a single mistake. He also never missed a day of work, not one. Even when his daughter Maya came down with a severe ear infection and the household was operating on minimal sleep, Darnell showed up on time and worked his full shift. Even when his car needed repairs and he had to arrange a complicated system of bus transfers that added 90 minutes to his commute, he arrived before his shift started. He stayed late without complaint when unexpected shipments came in. He volunteered to train new hires. He did everything that a model employee could possibly do. Which is why his stomach dropped when he opened his pay stub at the end of his 5th month and saw that his hourly wage had been reduced to $18. He stared at the number for a long time, certain that he must be misreading it. He had been hired at $19 per hour. He had worked harder than anyone else in the building. How could his pay have decreased? He approached Vernon's office the following morning, waiting until the owner seemed to have a free moment before knocking gently on the doorframe. Vernon was sitting behind his large wooden desk, scrolling through something on his computer, and he barely glanced up when Darnell entered. "Mr. Grayson, I had a question about my last paycheck," Darnell began, keeping his voice respectful and even. "My hourly rate seems to have dropped from 19 to 18. I was wondering if there might have been some kind of clerical error." Vernon finally looked up from his screen, his expression neutral, almost bored. He reached for a folder on the corner of his desk, opened it briefly, then closed it again without really examining its contents. "No error," he said flatly. "We do periodic adjustments based on performance assessments. Your rate has been adjusted to reflect that review." Darnell felt a wave of confusion wash over him. Performance assessments? Nobody had sat down with him to discuss his performance. There had been no review meeting, no feedback form, no indication that anyone was evaluating his work in any formal way. Everything he had heard from his coworkers and supervisors had been overwhelmingly positive. "I wasn't aware there had been a performance review," Darnell said carefully. "If there are areas where I need to improve, I'd really appreciate knowing what they are. I'm committed to doing whatever I can to contribute more to the team." Vernon's eyes flickered with something that might have been irritation. He shook his head dismissively. "It's standard procedure," he said. "We evaluate everyone from time to time. If you have concerns about your compensation, there are plenty of other places hiring right now. but I think you'll find that what we pay here is fair for the work being done." Darnell stood in the doorway for a moment longer, processing what he had just heard. Fair for the work being done. He was the most productive worker in the warehouse, and his pay had just been cut with no real explanation. Something about the exchange felt deeply wrong, but he could not quite articulate what it was. "Understood," he said quietly. "Thank you for your time." He turned and walked back to the warehouse floor, his mind churning with questions he could not answer. What was really happening here? Why would his pay decrease when everything about his performance said it should be going up? And what had Vernon meant when he said the pay was fair for the work being done? Over the next 2 months, Darnell continued to excel at his job while his unease continued to grow. Then, at the end of his 7th month with the company, his paycheck arrived with another reduction. His hourly rate had dropped again, this time to $17.25. The timing made no sense. The warehouse had just completed its most profitable quarter in company history, a fact that Vernon had proudly announced at a team meeting just 2 weeks earlier. He had thanked everyone for their hard work and mentioned that the company was in the strongest financial position it had been in for years. Orders were up, customer satisfaction was at an all-time high, and yet Darnell's wages were going down. He requested another meeting with Vernon, and this time he came prepared with questions. He kept his tone respectful but pressed harder for answers. He pointed out that the warehouse was performing better than ever. He noted that customer complaints were at historic lows. He asked directly whether everyone in the company was taking a pay cut or just him. Vernon's demeanor shifted during this conversation. The bored neutrality was replaced by something harder, colder. He told Darnell that material costs were increasing and that labor expenses needed to be reduced. When Darnell asked again whether everyone was affected, Vernon told him that what other employees were paid was none of his business. "I pay people what I think they're worth," Vernon said, his voice taking on an edge that Darnell had not heard before. "That's my right as a business owner. If you've got a problem with it, you know where the door is." Darnell left that meeting with a sick feeling in his stomach and a question burning in his mind. Was this really about performance or business costs? Or was something else going on, something that Vernon would never say out loud? That question would consume him for the next several weeks, and the answers he uncovered would confirm his worst suspicions. It started with casual observations and careful questions. Darnell began paying closer attention to his coworkers, listening more carefully during break room conversations, noting details he had previously overlooked. He did not want to seem paranoid or accusatory, so he approached the task with subtlety, weaving his questions into normal workplace conversations rather than directly interrogating anyone about their wages. The breakthrough came during a lunch break conversation with Marcus Webb, the delivery driver who had been with the company for about 14 months. They were sitting at one of the plastic tables in the small break room talking about the rising cost of rent in the area when Marcus mentioned that he was thinking about trading in his truck for something more fuel efficient. "I mean, with gas prices the way they are, it's eating into my paycheck," Marcus said. "But at least Vern bumped me up to $28 an hour last month. That helps." Darnell felt something cold settle in his chest. $28 an hour. Marcus was a decent worker, but he showed up late at least twice a week and had sideswiped a client's fence while making a delivery just 3 months earlier. The repair costs had come out of the company's insurance, and yet Marcus was earning nearly $11 more per hour than Darnell, the employee who had transformed the warehouse's efficiency and never made a single error. Over the following weeks, Darnell continued his quiet investigation. He would mention during casual conversations how expensive car insurance was getting, and people would naturally talk about their finances, including their wages. He would comment on the cost of his kids' school supplies, and co-workers would commiserate while revealing details about their own pay. Piece by piece, he assembled a picture of the compensation structure at Grayson Materials and Supply. What he discovered made him feel physically ill. Every single person working at that company was earning more than he was. Tyler Morrison, a 20-year-old kid who had been hired just 8 weeks earlier and still needed help finding basic items in the warehouse, was making $21 an hour. Angela Prescott, the part-time office administrator who worked 3 days a week, was earning $27. Kyle Dawson, the senior warehouse worker, made $30 an hour plus quarterly bonuses. Even the newest delivery driver, a guy named Scott who had started 2 months after Darnell and had already been written up for leaving a shipment at the wrong address, was pulling in $25. Darnell, the employee who had revolutionized the warehouse system, who had a perfect accuracy rate, who had never missed a single day of work, who stayed late without complaint and trained every new hire, was earning $17.25, the lowest wage in the entire company and sinking lower with each passing month. He sat in his car that evening after his shift ended, staring through the windshield at the warehouse where he had given so much of himself, and forced himself to confront the obvious truth. There was only one difference between him and every other employee at Grayson Materials. He was black, everyone else was white, and Vernon Grayson apparently believed that this difference justified paying him less. If you have ever been in a situation where you suspected you were being treated unfairly because of who you are, where the explanations you were given did not match the reality you could see with your own eyes, then you understand exactly what Darnell was feeling in that moment. It is a particular kind of pain, that recognition that someone views you as worth less, not because of what you do, but because of what you are. If this story is connecting with you, if you have experienced something similar or know someone who has, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you appreciate deep explorations of stories like this one, consider subscribing, because what Darnell did next is where everything began to change. Month 10 arrived, and Darnell's pay dropped once again. His hourly rate fell to $16, representing a loss of $3 per hour from his already lowered starting wage. At 50 hours per week, which was his typical schedule including overtime, that represented more than $600 a month in lost income. Money that could have helped with his daughter's braces, money that could have gone toward the car, repairs his family kept putting off, money that his household desperately needed. He sat at the kitchen table that night after the kids had gone to bed, showing Keisha the pay stubs he had been saving since his first day on the job. She looked at the numbers, looked at his face, and saw the exhaustion and anger warring in his expression. "What are you going to do?" she asked quietly. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "I know what's happening. I just don't know how to prove it." That weekend, Darnell called his older brother Gerald, who worked in human resources for a healthcare system in another city. Gerald knew employment law, understood how these situations typically unfolded, and had seen more than his share of discrimination cases during his career. "If this guy is doing what you think he's doing," Gerald said, "he's going to slip up eventually. People like that can't help themselves. They get comfortable, they let their guard down, and they say what they really think. Your job right now is to document everything and be ready when that moment comes. Write down every conversation, every date, every incident. Keep every pay stub. Save every email. Build a case file, even if you don't know exactly how you'll use it yet." Darnell took his brother's advice seriously. He began keeping meticulous records. Every pay stub was photographed and stored in a folder on his phone. Every conversation with Vernon was documented afterward, with dates, times, and summaries of what was said. He noted instances where he was treated differently than other workers, where tasks were assigned unfairly, where his contributions were overlooked while others were praised for lesser work. He created a timeline of his employment, showing the pattern of pay reductions against the backdrop of his exemplary performance. He was building a case without quite knowing what the case would be. He was preparing for a moment he could not predict, and that moment was coming closer than he knew. Month 12 arrived. Darnell's hourly pay dropped to $15. His patience was reaching its breaking point. He requested another meeting with Vernon, and this time his approach was different. He did not bring his documentation or try to negotiate. He simply asked the question that had been burning in his mind for months, the question he needed to ask out loud, even if he knew the answer would be a lie. "Mr. Grayson, I need to understand something," Darnell said, his voice steady despite the pounding of his heart. "I've been here for a year. I've worked harder than anyone in this building. I've never made a mistake on an order. I've never missed a day. I've trained half the people currently working in the warehouse. And in that time, my pay has dropped from $19 to $15. I've learned that I'm the lowest paid employee at this company. I need to know why." Vernon's face reddened as Darnell spoke, By the time Darnell finished, the older man was gripping the arms of his chair, his knuckles white. "You come into my office and accuse me of something like this?" Vernon's voice was rising. "After everything I've done for you. I gave you a job when nobody else would. I took a chance on you. And this is how you repay me." "I'm not accusing you of anything," Darnell said, maintaining his composure with effort. "I'm asking for an explanation. Because what's happening doesn't seem fair, and I'm not sure it's legal either." The word legal hung in the air between them like a dropped match near gasoline. Vernon stood up from his chair, his face now a deep crimson. "You want to talk about legal? Let me tell you something about legal. If you ever suggest again that I'm treating you unfairly because of your race, I will fire you on the spot. And then I'll make sure everyone in this industry knows that you're a troublemaker who makes false accusations against his employers. You'll never work in this county again. Do you understand me?" Darnell met Vernon's glare without flinching. In that moment, he saw something in the older man's eyes that confirmed everything he had suspected. It was not just anger, it was fear. The fear of someone who knows he has done something wrong and has just been confronted with the possibility that someone might be able to prove it. "I understand," Darnell said quietly. He stood up from the chair, walked out of Vernon's office, through the warehouse, and out in the back entrance into the parking lot. The afternoon air was thick with humidity, the kind of heavy warmth that presses against your skin and makes every breath feel like an effort. Darnell walked to his car, sat down in the driver's seat, and realized that his hands were shaking. He had never been threatened like that before. He had never been told that speaking up about unfair treatment would result in the destruction of his career. The message had been clear: accept the discrimination in silence or lose everything. He was about to start the car and drive home when he realized he had left his lunch cooler inside the warehouse, sitting on the shelf near the loading dock where he always kept it during his shift. For a moment, he considered just leaving it. But the cooler had been a birthday gift from his kids, a small insulated bag with his initials embroidered on the front. He was not going to leave it behind in that building. Darnell got out of his car and walked back toward the warehouse. But instead of entering through the main door, he took the side path that ran alongside the building, a shortcut that led to a side entrance near the loading area. This path took him past Vernon's office, which occupied a corner of the building with windows facing both the parking lot and the side walkway. As he approached, he heard Vernon's voice. The office window was open about 8 inches, propped ajar with a folded newspaper. The building's central air conditioning had been malfunctioning for over a week, and several of the offices had been supplementing with open windows and portable fans. Vernon's voice carried clearly through the gap, and Darnell stopped walking when he heard his own name. "I'm telling you, Marcus, you should have seen his face." Vernon was laughing. Actually laughing, the way someone might laugh while recounting an amusing anecdote to a friend. Darnell realized that Vernon was on the phone, probably with the friend he frequently mentioned from his college days. "He comes into my office with all this talk about fairness and legality, like he's got any idea what he's talking about." Darnell pressed his back against the wall, out of Vernon's line of sight, and listened. His heart was hammering so hard he was afraid Vernon might somehow hear it through the window. "Look, here's what I'm doing," Vernon continued, his voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. "I'm just going to keep trimming his paycheck until he finally breaks and walks out. I've got him down to 15 now. Probably drop him to 14 next month, maybe 13 after that. Eventually he'll give up, and I won't have to put up with people like him around here anymore." Darnell's hand moved to his pocket where his phone was stored. Moving as quietly as he could manage, he pulled out the device, opened the voice recording application, and pressed the red button to begin recording. He held the phone near the window, his hand trembling but steady enough to maintain position. "What do I mean, people like him?" Vernon repeated a question that his friend must have asked. There was a brief pause, and then Vernon's next words came through the window with devastating clarity. "Black people, Marcus. I never should have hired one. That was my mistake, and I've been paying for it ever since. But I can't just fire him outright. If I did that, he'd probably file some kind of discrimination lawsuit, so I'm making things miserable enough that he'll quit on his own. Then it's his decision, his choice to leave, and there's nothing he can do about it." The friend said something that Darnell could not hear, and Vernon responded with more laughter. "Exactly. What's he going to do? He's got no proof of anything. I pay him less. He gets frustrated. He quits. End of story. There's no law that says I have to pay everyone the same amount. I'm just using the system the way it's designed to be used." Darnell stood motionless against the wall, recording every word. Vernon continued talking for another 3 minutes, elaborating on his strategy, expressing his disgust at having to interact with Darnell every day, using language that revealed the depth of his bigotry in terms that left no room for alternative interpretation. He described how he had intentionally started Darnell at a lower wage than every other employee. He explained how each subsequent pay cut was designed to push Darnell closer to his breaking point. He laughed about how clever he had been, how there was no paper trail, no evidence, nothing that Darnell could point to as proof of discrimination. When the phone call finally ended, Darnell stopped the recording. He looked at the screen of his phone, at the audio file that now contained the most damaging confession he could have imagined, and felt the world shift beneath his feet. For months, he had suspected what was happening. He had documented the pay cuts, compiled the wage comparisons, built a circumstantial case that pointed toward discrimination, but could not definitively prove it. Now, in the span of a few minutes, Vernon Grayson had handed him everything: intent, motive, strategy, the explicit admission that race was the determining factor in every decision about Darnell's compensation. He walked to his car in a daze. He sat in the driver's seat for nearly half an hour, playing the recording back through his earbuds, listening to Vernon's voice describe with casual cruelty exactly what he had been doing and why. The sound quality was clear. The words were unmistakable. The racism was undeniable. Darnell had proof, real, incontrovertible proof. And now he had to decide what to do with it. That night, Darnell sat with Keisha at their kitchen table and played the recording for her. She listened with her hand pressed over her mouth, tears forming in her eyes as Vernon's words filled their small kitchen. When it ended, neither of them spoke for a long time. "What are you going to do?" Keisha finally asked, echoing the question she had asked weeks earlier, but now freighted with entirely different implications. "I'm going to find a lawyer," Darnell said. "I'm going to make sure this man faces consequences for what he's done." He did not sleep that night. By 2 in the morning, he was at the computer in their small home office, researching employment attorneys in the area. He found several who specialized in workplace discrimination, but one name kept appearing in the top search results: Patricia Reyes, an attorney who had built a reputation for taking on civil rights cases and winning them. Her firm's website described her as aggressive in pursuing justice for workers who had been subjected to illegal discrimination. The testimonials from former clients described her as relentless, compassionate, and deeply knowledgeable about employment law. Darnell composed an email at 3:30 in the morning, laying out his situation in careful detail. He described his employment history, the pattern of pay cuts, the wage comparisons he had compiled, and the recording he had captured that afternoon. He asked whether she would be willing to take his case. At 9:15 the following morning, his phone rang. It was Patricia Reyes. "Mr. Harris," she said, her voice professional but warm. "I've read your email 3 times since receiving it this morning. I need to hear that recording. Can you come to my office today?" 4 hours later, Darnell was sitting in a conference room in a modest office building about 25 miles from his home. Patricia Reyes was a woman in her late 40s with sharp eyes and an intensity that suggested she approached every case as if the outcome depended entirely on her personal effort. She listened as Darnell walked her through the entire history, from his first day at Grayson Materials to the recording he had captured the previous afternoon. When he finished, she asked to hear the audio file. Darnell played it through the speaker of his phone, watching her face as Vernon's words filled the room. Her expression remained carefully neutral, but her pen stopped moving on the notepad in front of her. When the recording ended, she asked to hear it again, then a third time. After the third playback, she set down her pen and looked directly at Darnell. "Mr. Harris, in 17 years of practicing employment law, I have encountered exactly 3 cases where the evidence was this clear. This recording is not suggestive of discrimination. It is not circumstantial. It is a complete confession. Your employer admitted his strategy, his intent, and his motivation in explicit terms. He stated unambiguously that race was the determining factor in your compensation. He described a deliberate scheme to force you out through economic pressure rather than direct termination, specifically to avoid the legal consequences of discrimination. He handed you everything you would ever need to prove this case in court. She paused, allowing the weight of her assessment to settle. I want to represent you, she continued, and I want you to understand something. With this evidence, we are not hoping for justice. We are going to deliver it. The next several weeks unfolded with methodical precision. Patricia Reyes and her team built a comprehensive legal case around the recording and Darnell's documentation. They compiled the timeline of pay reductions, showing how Darnell's wages had dropped from $19 to $15 over the course of 12 months, while his performance remained exemplary. They assembled the wage comparisons, demonstrating that every other employee at Grayson Materials earned substantially more, despite inferior performance records. They documented the verbal threats Vernon had made during their final confrontation. They prepared a demand letter that laid out the violations of federal and state employment law in devastating detail. The demand letter was 18 pages long. It quoted extensively from Vernon's recorded confession, including his explicit statements about race being his motivation. It referenced the protections guaranteed under federal civil rights statutes, explaining how Vernon's actions violated laws that had been on the books for over half a century. It calculated the compensation Darnell was owed for lost wages based on what he would have earned if he had been paid at the same rate as similarly situated white employees. It added damages for emotional distress caused by the discrimination and the hostile work environment. It included Darnell's legal fees and projected costs. The total demand was $97,000, plus a written apology, mandatory anti-discrimination training, and a public acknowledgement of the company's wrongdoing. The letter gave Vernon Grayson 14 days to respond before a formal lawsuit would be filed in federal court. Vernon received the demand letter on a Thursday afternoon in mid-December. According to accounts that emerged later, his initial reaction was disbelief, followed by rage. He reportedly threw the letter across his office and insisted to his secretary that the whole thing was a fabrication, that Darnell could not possibly have recorded any conversation because the door to his office had been closed that day. His attorney, a man named Bradley Fitch, who handled business matters for several local companies, read the demand letter with considerably more concern. He insisted on hearing the recording before advising Vernon on how to respond. Vernon resisted at first, continuing to insist that no recording could exist, before finally admitting that his office window had been open that afternoon because the air conditioning was broken. Patricia Reyes provided a copy of the audio file to Fitch's office. The attorney listened to his client confess to systematic racial discrimination in clear, unambiguous terms. The pause that followed lasted nearly a full minute. "Vernon," Fitch said finally, "you have a very serious problem." What followed was a week of increasingly urgent consultations between Vernon and his legal team. They reviewed the evidence, analyzed the strength of Darnell's case, and assessed the realistic outcomes of different strategies. The recording was devastating, even if they could somehow challenge its admissibility. The pattern of pay cuts and wage disparities provided strong circumstantial evidence on their own. Fighting the case would cost a fortune in legal fees and would likely result in a judgment substantially higher than the current settlement demand. But Vernon Grayson was not a man accustomed to backing down. He had built his business through stubbornness and aggression. He had never paid a settlement in his life. The idea of writing a check to Darnell Harris, the employee he had been trying to force out for over a year, was more than his pride could accept. Against his attorney's strong advice, Vernon instructed Fitch to send a response rejecting the settlement demand. The response claimed that the recording had been obtained illegally and was therefore inadmissible as evidence. It denied all allegations of discrimination. It characterized Darnell's claims as extortion. This was Vernon Grayson's final mistake. Patricia Reyes had anticipated this response. Recording laws vary by jurisdiction, but the fundamental principle in most states is that recording a conversation is permissible when there is no reasonable expectation of privacy. Vernon had been speaking at normal volume near an open window in an area where employees regularly walked. The parking lot and side pathway were not private spaces. Any court would likely find that Darnell had captured the conversation legally. More importantly, even if the recording had been excluded, the documentary evidence Darnell had compiled told a compelling story on its own. The pattern was clear. The disparities were undeniable. The recording was powerful, but it was not the only weapon in their arsenal. Patricia filed a formal lawsuit in federal court within a week of receiving Vernon's rejection. The filing was comprehensive and devastating, laying out the full history of discrimination and including key excerpts from Vernon's own words. Once filed, the lawsuit became a matter of public record. The local newspaper picked up the story within days. The headline read, "Millbrook business owner accused of racial discrimination in pay scheme." The article detailed the allegations from the lawsuit, including several quotes from Vernon's recorded confession. It spread across social media within hours. The response from the community was swift and fierce. Contractors who had been doing business with Grayson Materials for years began calling to cancel their accounts. Some were quiet about it, simply shifting their orders to competitors without explanation. Others were vocal, posting statements on their own social media pages explaining that they could not continue to support a company whose owner had been caught on tape expressing racist views and deliberately underpaying a black employee. Vernon's suppliers got nervous too. Several major distributors who provided products to Grayson Materials reached out to express concern about the negative publicity. One announced that they were reviewing their relationship with the company, pending the outcome of the legal proceedings. Within 3 weeks of the lawsuit being filed, Grayson Materials and Supply had lost nearly half of its customer base. The phones that had once rung constantly with new orders fell silent. The warehouse that had been bustling with activity grew quiet. Employees who had been there for years began looking for other jobs, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. Vernon finally understood the gravity of his situation. His lawyer made it clear that continuing to fight the lawsuit was financially suicidal. The evidence was overwhelming. Public opinion had already rendered its verdict. The longer this dragged on, the worse the damage would become. 4 weeks after the lawsuit was filed, Vernon Grayson agreed to enter settlement negotiations. The negotiations lasted over a week. Patricia Reyes pushed aggressively, knowing that she held nearly all the leverage. Vernon's business was hemorrhaging customers and revenue. His reputation was in ruins. His only path forward was to settle quickly and hope that the story would eventually fade from public attention. The final settlement included multiple components. First, Vernon was required to pay Darnell $97,000 in total compensation. This amount covered the wages Darnell should have earned if he had been paid at the same rate as other employees from the day he was hired, calculated at a differential of approximately $5 per hour over more than 50 hours per week for 12 months. It included additional compensation for emotional distress caused by the discrimination and the hostile work environment Vernon had created. It covered all of Darnell's legal fees. Second, Vernon was required to pay a fine of $21,000 to the state's Civil Rights Enforcement Agency. This penalty was separate from the compensation to Darnell and represented the state's interest in punishing employers who violated anti-discrimination statutes. Third, Vernon was required to issue a formal written apology to Darnell acknowledging the discrimination. The apology had to be reviewed and approved by Patricia's office before it was finalized and delivered. Fourth, Vernon was required to implement mandatory anti-discrimination training for himself and all current and future employees, conducted by an approved provider and documented for verification. Fifth, Vernon was required to post a notice in his place of business for a period of 18 months stating that the company had violated civil rights laws and had been required to compensate an employee for racial discrimination. The notice would be visible to all customers, employees, and visitors. Vernon signed the settlement agreement in late January, approximately 13 weeks after Darnell captured the recording that changed everything. The $97,000 payment was made within 10 days. The $21,000 fine was paid to the state shortly thereafter, but the financial penalties were not the true measure of Vernon Grayson's punishment. The true punishment was watching everything he had built collapse around him. By the time the settlement was finalized, Grayson Materials and Supply had lost more than 60% of its customers. The construction community throughout the region had learned what kind of person Vernon Grayson was. Contractors who had never even done business with him knew his name and his story. Nobody wanted to be associated with the man who had been caught on tape expressing racist views and systematically cheating his best employee. Vernon tried to recover. He issued public statements expressing regret and promising to do better. He offered dramatic discounts to try to win back customers. He reached out personally to contractors who had canceled their accounts, asking for another chance. But the community had rendered its judgment. Trust, once destroyed, is not easily rebuilt. Reputation, once lost, does not return on request. 6 months after the settlement, Grayson Materials and Supply closed its doors permanently. Vernon filed for bankruptcy. The warehouse building where Darnell had transformed operations and worked so hard was sold to pay off creditors. The inventory was liquidated at auction. The employees who had remained through the scandal had to find work elsewhere. The business Vernon Grayson had spent over 2 decades building was gone, destroyed not by market forces or bad luck, but by his own hatred and the choices that hatred drove him to make. Let me pause here to make something clear. Darnell Harris did not destroy Vernon Grayson's business. Vernon Grayson destroyed his own business. He made the choice to pay a black employee less than white employees doing the same work. He made the choice to systematically reduce that employee's wages in an attempt to force him out. He made the choice to threaten and intimidate rather than address legitimate concerns about fairness. He made the choice to express his bigotry openly on a phone call without checking whether his window was open. Every consequence that followed flowed directly from Vernon's choices. What do you think about this outcome? Did Vernon get what he deserved, or do you feel the consequences were too severe or not severe enough? I want to hear your honest up on bills that had been piling up, including the electricity bill that had been on the verge of resulting in disconnection. They were able to afford the braces their daughter needed. They put a down payment on a small house in a better neighborhood, their first home after years of renting. More importantly, Darnell found a new job within 3 weeks of the settlement being finalized. A construction supply company in a neighboring county had followed the news coverage and was impressed by Darnell's reputation for excellence. The owner reached out directly to offer him a position. The starting wage was $33 per hour with full benefits, nearly double what Vernon had been paying him at the end. I can tell a lot about a person by how they handle adversity. The new owner told Darnell during their first meeting, "What you did, standing up for yourself like that, documenting everything, seeing it through to the end, that tells me you're exactly the kind of person I want on my team." Within 18 months at his new company, Darnell had been promoted twice. He now manages a team of warehouse workers, applying the organizational systems he developed years ago to make the operation more efficient than it has ever been. He earns $39 per hour plus performance bonuses. His employer treats him with respect. He has never experienced anything like what Vernon Grayson put him through. But the effects of Vernon's discrimination did not disappear simply because Darnell's circumstances improved. For months after leaving Grayson Materials, he found himself questioning his own worth. The constant pay cuts, the dismissive treatment, the implicit message that he was somehow less valuable than everyone around him, all of that had left wounds that took time to heal. Discrimination does not just steal money, it steals confidence. It makes you question whether maybe, somehow, the people mistreating you might be right about you. The settlement and the public exposure of Vernon's racism helped to repair that damage. It confirmed what Darnell had known all along, but had begun to doubt, that he was an excellent employee who deserved fair treatment. The problem had never been Darnell. The problem had always been Vernon. Patricia Reyes's law office was flooded with calls in the months after the settlement was announced. People who had been experiencing workplace discrimination but did not know what to do about it saw the news coverage and realized that their own situations might be illegal. Several new cases were filed against other employers in the region, cases that might never have come forward without the visibility that Darnell's case provided. The case also sent a message to employers throughout the area. It demonstrated that civil rights laws have real teeth, that discrimination can result in devastating consequences, that the person you are mistreating might be documenting everything and waiting for you to make a mistake. Some employers responded by reviewing their pay practices, making sure their compensation structures were equitable and could withstand scrutiny. Nobody wanted to be the next Vernon Grayson. Today, nearly 4 years after the settlement, people in Millbrook still talk about what happened at Grayson Materials and Supply. It has become a local cautionary tale, a story that parents tell their children about the cost of hatred and the possibility of justice. The warehouse building that once housed Vernon's business is now occupied by a flooring distributor owned by someone else entirely. Vernon's name is gone from the sign. It is as if the company never existed, except it did exist. And what happened there matters. It matters to Darnell Harris, who finally received the justice he deserved. It matters to other workers who learned that they do not have to accept discrimination in silence. It matters to employers who learn that bigotry has a price that can be higher than they ever imagined. And it matters to everyone who believes that a person's worth should be determined by what they do, not by the color of their skin. Vernon Grayson lost his business. He paid nearly $120,000 in settlements and fines. He declared bankruptcy and lost most of his assets. He saw his reputation destroyed in the community where he had lived and worked for decades. He now works for someone else, earning a fraction of what he once made, with no prospect of ever rebuilding what he lost. All because he could not bring himself to pay a black man the same wages as everyone else. All because his hatred was stronger than his business sense. All because he made a phone call near an open window. This is what justice can look like. It is not always fast. It is not always guaranteed. It requires patience, documentation, persistence, and sometimes a moment of luck. But when it arrives, when someone who thought they were untouchable finally faces consequences for their actions, it demonstrates that the principles we claim to believe in, equality, fairness, the dignity of every person, are not just words on paper. Darnell Harris did not set out to become a symbol or a lesson. He simply refused to accept being treated as less than he was worth. He documented everything. He waited for his moment. And when that moment came, he was ready. Sometimes justice arrives through a cracked window on a humid afternoon. Sometimes hatred costs you everything. And sometimes when you have the courage to stand up and the evidence to back you up, the system actually works. If this story made you think about your own workplace, about fairness, about what you would do if you discovered you were being treated differently because of who you are, then it has served its purpose. Remember that you have rights. Remember that documentation matters. And remember that even when the people with power think they are too smart to get caught, they are often wrong. Thank you for staying with this story until the end. If it resonated with you, subscribe for more deep explorations of cases like this one, stories where ordinary people stand up against injustice and change not only their own lives, but send messages that echo far beyond their own circumstances. The question I leave you with is simple but important. What would you have done in Darnell's position? Would you have stayed and documented and waited, or would you have walked away? There is no wrong answer, but it is a question worth thinking about, because you never know when you might find yourself facing a choice like that, and how you answer could change everything.